Okay, in this lecture, we'll talk about Texas in the 1970s. In the last lecture, we talked about Texas in the 1960s. And so we're going to see a little bit of overlap between the two, but I thought I would break it up into decades because there were very significant things that happened in specific decades. But actually, before we move into the 1970s, I think it's important for us to pause for a minute and talk about the year of 1968, which leads us right into the 1970s and was a significant time in American history that has a big effect on what's happening in Texas. Now, when you're thinking about 1968, it was an extremely turbulent time in American history. It was, seen as there was quite a bit of resistance. Some people have actually dubbed this year 1968 year of hate because of all the very negative things that happened in 1968. But I want to back up for a moment and talk about the Vietnam War specifically. Okay, so the Vietnam War, America actually was involved in Vietnam since 1954. Four presidents actually were involved in it. Eisenhower, then Kennedy, then LBJ, and later Nixon. Okay, LBJ had the largest role of the most amount of troops, and he also received quite a bit of resistance, arguably as much, if not equal to what Nixon received as well, with his continued presence in Vietnam. But we see students who are galvanizing and mobilizing, the New Left in Austin at this time, really kind of step forward and protest what they're seeing. During this time period. So in 1968, one of the big people that is actually against the Vietnam War, is very outspoken about it, is Martin Luther King Jr., who worked with LBJ earlier and tried to work with LBJ on civil rights legislation and did, but they grew apart when it came to the Vietnam War. And that's because the people that were drafted in the war were disproportionately black. And that was blazingly, obviously an issue for MLK at the time, obviously, and many others. And so this actually separates any kind of relationship that LBJ and MLK had at all, to a point where MLK, after when he's assassinated, LBJ doesn't go to his funeral. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that that rift really did exist. LBJ actually makes the decision in 1968 not to run again, and that was because of all the backlash he received because of Vietnam. He did a lot of things regarding social progress in the United States with his Great Society, but his presidency is going to be forever stained because of his actions in Vietnam. Robert Kennedy is also assassinated the next month or next couple months after MLK, and he's significant because he's the brother of JFK, and the civil rights movement and the African American community specifically was really putting their heart into supporting Robert Kennedy, because he really was pushing for desegregation, for more civil rights action. And so that, kind of pushes away any kind of hope a lot of civil rights leaders had in the future leadership in the country. There's also violence at the Democratic National Committee, mainly over the protests in Vietnam. And even women begin to speak up. We start to see a growing women's movement, which I'll talk about quite a bit in this lecture. And in this women's movement, they are protesting they're protesting the Miss America contest. They're doing bra burning in 1968. Okay. Also, 1968, Nixon wins an election again, and Nixon, his presidency will be shaped, or his election, and then Watergate is really shaped by this paranoia. He was so afraid to lose again, like he thought he had it in the bag in 1960. So he is very concerned about that, and so he woos the silent majority, the Dixiecrats of the South, and wins the presidential election. And actually, ironically, the only positive thing that really happens in 1968 is that the Apollo mission does finally make its first journey to the moon at the end of December 1968. And there's even like newspapers that say, the Apollo mission saved 1968. The other person that decides not to run again, and I didn't mention this before, was also John Connally. So he actually decides to step down in 1968 as well. There were major changes in politics that were federal but had a big effect on Texas history at that time. Two big SCOTUS decisions, Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims. Those increased representation in urban areas, which allowed more minorities to be able to vote and more minority representation in Texas nationally. The 24th Amendment was passed, and I mentioned this um, in the last lecture, but Texas kept its poll tax for quite a while, at least at the state election level. And we start to see blacks entering Texas politics again, the first time really since Reconstruction. So this is very significant, right? Barbara Jordan, she was from the Houston's Fifth Ward. She becomes the first African American to be elected to the Texas Senate since Reconstruction. And of course, not only was she black, but she was a woman, right? A woman of color. Curtis Graves, J.E. Lockridge, both elected to Texas House as well. The other thing that happens that's related to Vietnam as well is that the voting age is lowered from the 21 to 18, and that had to do with the fact that people said if you're old enough to fight, you're old enough to vote. So, and that was directly related to Vietnam. They also lowered the drinking age, which I'll talk to you more about maybe sometime when I have a little bit more time. All right, so another thing that happened significantly is that women start to enter the scene in Texas politics as well. Now we knew that there were precursors to this in the 1950s. There were girls' state clubs and all kinds of things that were trying to motivate women to get a voice in politics, and we start to see this become more of a reality in the 1970s and in the late 1960s. There were women of color that were elected, and I've got some names here of women of color who were elected to local positions. Also, San Antonio's first female mayor, Lila Cockrell, and there's a picture of her here. She's the first female mayor in any Texas city to be elected. Sissy Farenthold, she's going to be a very influential politician of this time. She's going to run for governor a few times, won't win, but significant at that. And then Sarah Weddington, and I'll talk about her because she's going to be the lawyer at the center of Roe versus Wade. There were also Republican women, like I mentioned, Kay Bailey, who's actually now Kay Bailey Hutchinson, and other women that were also Republicans as well, involved in Texas politics. So the feminist movement really begins in the 1960s. And carries through the 1970s into the 1980s even so. Okay, and there's a great video about this thing called the Equal Rights Amendment, and it's this pulling between whether or not an Equal Rights Amendment should be added to the U.S. Constitution. It is not in the U.S. Constitution. Okay, spoiler alert on that. And the thing is that it was passed by Congress finally, but it needs 3/4 of the states to ratify it in their state legislature in order for it to become an amendment, and that has never happened. Okay, that actually never happened. However, Texas, interestingly enough, passed its own Equal Rights Amendment, one of the first in the country to do that just at a state level, and they were one of the first to ratify the National Amendment, which of course never came to be. So Texas was significant in that sense, right? The other thing is that the National Organization for Women was established, which was a very, large feminist organization founded by Betty Friedan, and Title IX, which allowed women to participate in activities previously closed to them. Okay, Texas was also the site of the Battle of the Sexes between Billie Jean King against a very chauvinist man, and she beat him in tennis, trying to say that men were just better at sports, right? And I told you I had mentioned the Roe versus Wade case, and so this case obviously has much significance today because we know that it was overturned recently. But the Roe versus Wade case actually was a Texas case. It was a woman named Norma McCorvey, who they dubbed her Jane Roe, and that's where Roe versus Wade gets its name from, right? So she protested a Texas restrictive abortion law, challenged the Dallas County DA, district attorney by the name of Henry Wade. That's where Wade comes in. And actually the U.S. District Court overturned the state's restrictive abortion limitations. And so Wade challenged that and brought it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in a 7-2 victory for Roe, abortion rights were confirmed. Essentially what the Roe versus Wade decision said was that no states can make a restriction on abortion in the first trimester. Second and third, they could put restrictions drawn if it had to do with the health of the mother. And so in those cases, that part of it would go to the state, but they couldn't restrict it at all in the first trimester. We do know that that was overturned by Dobbs v. Jackson, Women Health Organization, in 2022. And we know that now it's a 5-4 decision, so it was a very close decision in the Supreme Court. However, that case itself basically gave the states the rights to vote on what they wanted to do. We know Texas has one of the very most restrictive laws right now, but throughout the United, I think Ohio recently passed one that upheld the right of abortion rights for women, and so we see this unfolding even today. And I did mention this before, but we also see more and more of the Chicano movement grow in Texas in the 1970s. By 1970, 2 million Mexican Americans resided in Texas. That's about 1 out of every 5 Texans that were there. Contrary to popular belief, almost half of them were middle class. They weren't lower class income workers, although there was a significant group that protested, that joined the labor movement. But one of the most significant movements of this time was La Raza Unida, which translates to United Race or United People, and they formed the Raza Unida Party, the RUP, and they basically kind of lit a fire under these other organizations that they thought were kind of tiptoeing around more radical changes. And so they were specifically targeting LULAC and American GI Forum that were concerned about looking communist and, the Red Scare movement. And so they really focused on pushing for more radical changes for Mexican Americans, centering around very much similar to the Black nationalist movement in which Black Pride really showed during this time period. We see also Chicano pride and Chicano culture coming a lot from this group as well. And we also see like legal and educational funds challenging different cases in courts as well. And another thing that happens in the 1970s, which affects politics as well, is a big political scandal that's centered around a bank. So there was a man by the name of Frank Sharp, and he essentially bribed Texas state officials to push through a banking bill, and I won't go into all the specific details on that banking bill and how it would benefit him, but essentially it would benefit him if this banking bill was pushed through. And so he basically bribed officials to do this and said, as soon as like that bill passes, sell your stock. And when it sells your stock, you're going to make a huge profit, right? And so this was against SEC, which is Security Exchange Commission, is an organization that was founded to reform like stock market issues that happened during the Great Depression. But essentially, when that happened, it came to light what happened. This is in 1971. 3 politicians, significant state politicians, are convicted of this. And it caused a lot of people to begin to push further left, seeing this old guard that was part of Texas politics as really dangerous to Texas and to the future of democracy in Texas. It's important to note that the Democratic Party at this time nationally was becoming much more feminist and much more liberal, and so it had completely lost, right, the Dixiecrats from the 1968 election. They were part of the Republican Party now, and so the Democratic Party begins to really change and become much more liberal. Texas Democrats are more moderate than the national Democrats are, but they're still pretty liberal. Okay, 1972 elections were pretty significant. Texas Republicans do pick up some House seats, which was significant to them, and their control of the Texas legislature will grow and grow, which we'll talk about more in our next and final module. The Raza Unida Party actually does put forth a candidate who gathers quite a few, votes. However, and it almost causes the Democratic candidate to actually lose the governorship because they pulled a lot of Democrat liberal votes away from him. But the more moderate Dolph Briscoe, who is very pro education and was still a moderate Democrat, becomes the next governor of Texas at this time. Okay, so I wanted to show you this too because I think it's kind of interesting. This kind of shows you the shift by 1972 of politics. You can see in here that a lot of these panhandle areas become very red. This is what I told you about before, where the Republican Party begins to grow in some of these areas. However, you see a lot of areas are still very blue, and then you start to see Munoz, who got a lot of these down here in the valley, he got the La Risa Unida party, and of course this is a large, Chicano group that's here at that time. Okay, so the other big change we see, or things, the lack of change, I guess, is the fact that the Texas Constitution is still here, the one from 1876, and it's even the one that's still here today. So that's really crazy to think about. Today, it's 63,000 words about. It's one of the lengthiest state constitutions in the United States, okay? They did add a lot of amendments to the Texas Constitution. 91 amendments were added in the 1980s. As I mentioned before, the federal government begins to intervene and force integration in areas in Texas that were not intervened. And also Briscoe loses his third term in 1978. And this is the time that I'm really going to end the lecture today. Actually, I'm going to talk about one more thing that has to do with Texas here, but I do want to say I'm going to stop there because 1978 was a significant shift in politics in Texas. That's when we start to see the Republican Party really begin to take over Texas at that time. But so that's where we see some changing that happens in Texas and in the United States at that time too. Economically, Texas was doing pretty well. It was still extremely reliant on oil, and this really is just exacerbated even more when in the 1970s there's a huge oil shortage because of an Arab oil embargo by OPEC, which is the cartel that controls the prices of the major oil producing countries in the world. And so when this happens, the demand and price of Texas oil raises, but in 1981 when OPEC dropped its prices again, that hurt the oil industry. Commercial airlines become a thing really in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and of course 80s even more. And we know that Southwest Airlines was formed in 1967. It primarily was just created just to taxi people between Texas cities, but we know that it's an international company now. And we also know the two biggest airports in Texas, Houston International Airport, IAH, and Dallas Fort Worth, DFW at it, but it's DFW, were both formed during this time period as well. Tourism is a big growth. Big Bend, South Padre Island, Six Flags, which is now Fiesta, Texas, right? Hemisphere Park, and that's going to be the source of our field trip this week will be to Hemisphere Park, which was created in 1968 to commemorate San Antonio's 250-year anniversary. Anyway, but what the biggest tourist attraction today in Texas remains is the Riverwalk, which we talked about before we talked about the New Deal, since it was created through the New Deal. Okay, so the next module is our last module. It will talk about 1978 and push through modern times today. So you'll kind of be caught up, hopefully, on everything that's happened in Texas and where we are today in Texas.